The blizzard hadn't come yet when the mockery started. That came earlier, in the dry months, when the creeks were still running and the men in the settlement still had bark in their laughter. Back then, she was just that widow in the cave, a walking oddity, a woman whose husband had died 2 years back from a burst appendix that no doctor ever got to see. She buried him alone, carved his name into a smooth rock with a chisel and hammer, then walked back into the cave where they'd wintered before, and never left. By the time the others came over the ridge and started raising cabins of pine and spruce, she was already vanished behind the curtain of stone. She didn't join their barn raisings, didn't trade eggs or salt pork, didn't show up for Sunday gatherings. A few women tried to be neighborly at first, knocking with canned peaches or half a pie, but she turned them away with such silent, steady sadness that they never came back. And the men? They snickered around the fire about what kind of woman would crawl back in the dirt like a fox and call it home. But it was a home, not a hole, not a lair, not a shameful thing. And if any of them had walked the stone trail up to her ridge in earnest, really looked, they'd have seen what her husband had built before he passed. A mouth of limestone carved just deep enough into the mountain to trap warmth and keep out wind, walls shored up with stacked flat stone, a thick canvas flap to hold heat like a lung holds breath, and a chimney vent punched through the rock, trailing smoke year-round. No one asked, no one cared because no one needed to, until the sky changed. It started with the cattle freezing. A week before the real blizzard, the frost came early and unnatural. Hogs froze upright, eyes glassed over like they'd seen something coming. Chickens died in their own coops, wings tucked under. And then, the snow. Not the kind you brush off a roof or shake off your boots, but a storm that hung like a curse, slow and deliberate, dragging itself over the valley with snow so thick it blanketed the air in silence. Wind so constant it whined through cabin cracks like a whisper you couldn't unhear. Roofs collapsed in the second week, chimneys clogged with ice, and the firewood, the precious firewood that took all fall to cut, burned too fast. There was never enough. Not when the wind crawled through floorboards like a serpent and the windows breathed frost from the inside. But not up in the cave. The widow, her name was Ruth Hale, though most had forgotten, wasn't suffering the way they were. Her cave, perched just above the valley's basin halfway up Black Ridge, was dry as bone. The stone soaked no snow. The heat from her little cast-iron stove rolled off the walls and curled back toward her like a second fire. She had no panes of glass to frost over, no chimney to clog, just a vent that stayed warm from the smoke. Her root cellar was the cave itself. She'd canned through summer and dried meat through fall, tucked it deep in crevices where no moisture reached. She had enough beans and salt pork and dried apples to feed 3 people, but she was only one. The storm hit hardest on January 3rd. That morning Ruth heard nothing outside. Not even whined. It was that kind of silence that doesn't come from peace but from the world holding its breath. She opened the canvas flap and looked out carefully. The valley below was invisible, just white, endless white. Somewhere beneath it were chimneys and logs and prayers whispered in shaking breath, but she couldn't see them. Only sky and snow blending into one thick veil. The next sound she heard wasn't the wind, it was knocking. Not at her door, there wasn't one, but at the rock. A kind of slap, desperate and unpracticed. She stood slowly. Her hand went to the side, to the heavy wooden staff she still kept near the stove, half weapon, half walking stick. She didn't speak, just pulled the flap aside. A man stumbled in. He fell more than walked, knees giving out just past the entrance. He collapsed into the warmth like a dying man into a dream. His lips were blue, his fingers so stiff they looked carved, and still, he was luckier than most. He had made it. Ruth dropped to her knees beside him and rubbed his arms, stripped the gloves from his hands, pulled off his coat, wrapped him in one of her blankets. No questions yet, not until the shaking stopped. When his eyes finally opened, hours later, he stared at her like he wasn't sure she was real. His voice came out cracked and slow. "Hail your hail, the cave woman." Ruth didn't answer. She poured hot water into a tin cup and pushed it to his lips. He drank, coughed, then said, They wouldn't listen. I told them, said the roofs wouldn't hold, said you were smart building here. That made her pause. She sat across from him, resting on a flat stone beside the stove. What's your name? He looked ashamed. Wheeler, John Wheeler, from the Southern Ridge. He'd laughed at her before. She remembered him, a braggart with sharp teeth and loud boots, but now he was hunched and hollow. You're the first I've seen since the ice took the trees, he whispered. Cabins fell. Firewood ran out. Mary Rusk's boys froze in their beds, 3 of 'em. That was 2 nights ago. Ruth didn't flinch, but her fingers tightened around the cup. Why'd you come here? He looked down. Because I knew you wouldn't die. That night Ruth set an extra log in the stove, let him sleep near the heat, his breath curling like smoke. She sat against the far wall, eyes open, listening. The next knock came 3 days later. A woman this time, carrying a child too frozen to cry, her own hands cracked from frostbite, face raw from wind. Ruth pulled her in without asking a name, fed her broth, took the child and held him close to her chest until he moved. Hours later, the woman whispered, We thought you were a ghost. Ruth didn't answer, but in the silence they all listened. There were no birds, no wind, just the hiss of flame against iron. The cave was alive while the valley died. By the end of the week, there were 8 of them. Some she remembered, some she didn't. One woman from the northern basin had walked barefoot after her boots split from cold. One man carried his father on his back for miles. They came not because they believed in Ruth, but because the snow had no mercy and the cabins had collapsed one by one. And somehow, the cave held. The others asked questions sometimes, about how she knew, why she built here, what she saw coming that they hadn't. Ruth didn't always answer. She was not cruel, but she wasn't warm either. She just was, a quiet spine among the broken. That night the stove hissed and the shadows danced on the rock. 8 souls huddled in a cave carved by grief and foresight. The blizzard raged above. And in the silence Ruth stood, looked toward the flap and whispered only once. There's more coming. The second wave of the storm didn't come with a warning. It came with a burial. Somewhere in the early blue hours of morning, Ruth stepped beyond the mouth of the cave with the wooden staff in her hand and nearly vanished into white. The snowfall had thickened to the point that she could barely make out the edge of the ridge just 15 feet away. A single step wrong, and she could tumble into the gully that lay hidden beneath the snowbank below. She leaned into the wind like someone leaning into a scream, boots digging into the ice stone beneath her. She didn't stay long. Just long enough to check the narrow chimney slit, still clear, and to listen. There were no birds, no dogs, no axes splitting wood, no hammering. No one was cutting down trees now, no one was hauling timber. The world had gone still, save for the distant creaks of trees dying under the weight of snow. When she returned inside, they all looked at her. The 7 others, now huddled in 2s and 3s, had grown used to the low, womb-like warmth of the cave. No frost reached them, but no sunlight either, just the orange flicker of the stove casting every face in shadows. The young mother, her hands still wrapped in bandages, pulled her child closer to her chest and asked, "How long?" Ruth didn't answer, not because she didn't know, but because she did. John Wheeler, who had once been the loudest man in the valley and now spoke barely above a whisper, sat cross-legged near the stove, eyes distant. "When I came down off the ridge," he said slowly, "the river was frozen solid. The cabins by the eastern bluff were crushed, timbers split right down the middle like matchsticks. I saw one man's body." "Stop," Ruth said. Wheeler's mouth shut. The child coughed, dry and small. It didn't sound like illness, it sounded like cold trying to claw back in. Ruth took her pot off the iron stove and poured out the last of the elk broth she'd boiled the night before. No one said anything about rations. They didn't need to. They'd all begun to notice that she never ate. By the fourth day, the smoke was black. It curled strangely through the chimney vent and came back into the cave, thick and choking. Ruth climbed out again and disappeared into the white. It was like stepping into a dream. The world outside no longer resembled the place she had lived the last decade. Trees were gone, either collapsed or bent like old spines. The stream bed that once cut a ribbon across the slope was invisible, and the trail down to the cabins below, gone. She scaled the rock face above the vent slowly, step by deliberate step, until she reached the carved chimney outlet. The hole was partially clogged, ice and snow packed into a dam. She took her gloved hands and cleared it, chunk by chunk, breath steaming around her as she leaned over it like someone digging their own grave. Every gust of wind tried to knock her loose from the stone. Then she saw the shape. Not far off, slumped in the snow, upright, human. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't rush. Rushing got people killed out here. She climbed down the outcrop and stepped forward, measuring every pace until she reached it. It was a boy, no older than 15, frozen upright, face twisted in a way that suggested he hadn't died peacefully. His hands were red and raw, stiff against his sides. He had no hat, just a ragged coat and one boot. She stood over him for a long time. Then she began to dig. It took an hour to clear enough snow to wrap him, another to drag him back to the cave. She didn't wake the others. She set his body near the wall and covered him, not with burial cloths, she had none, but with a wool blanket. When they saw him the next morning, no one asked who he was. They just knew what it meant. More were coming. They came as shadows first, bent figures staggering across snow, drawn like moths to the thin whisper of smoke that rose from her chimney. One man knocked and collapsed before anyone could answer. A woman arrived hours later with 2 children, one limp in her arms, the other walking behind, eyes blank. Ruth let them all in. By the end of that week, there were 13. The cave was not big, not built for that many. The warmth began to thin. The firewood stack shrank by the hour. Still, she rationed. She taught them how to cook over coals, how to sleep in pairs to share heat, how to rotate shifts by the stove. She gave the children the warmest spots, near the wall where the stone still breathed out summer's memory. She hung blankets across the interior to form makeshift walls. She made it a home. It wasn't kindness, not really, it was memory. Her husband had died in winter. He had coughed for 2 nights before she realized he was bleeding inside. By then, the trail to town was gone. She tried to carry him, only made it half a mile before he died in her arms, his breath coming out in red mist. She laid him on a bed of pine needles beneath the rock where they'd first kissed. Then she came back to the cave and stayed. So now, when the world collapsed again, she knew how to survive. But not everyone inside did. The first fight came on the 9th day. Wheeler had begun hoarding biscuits, the dried kind Ruth had saved in cloth sacks. Ruth hadn't seen it happen, but the little girl, Lizzie, the one with chapped lips and copper hair, pointed at him with trembling fingers. He took 3. Wheeler rose, ashamed, stammering, "I didn't, she's mistaken, she's..." Ruth didn't raise her voice. She just looked at him. "You'll sleep outside tonight," she said. Silence. "You can take a blanket, not 2, and you'll come back in when I say." He looked around, wild. "You're joking." No one laughed. That night Wheeler sat wrapped in wool just outside the flap. The snow still came, though slower now. The wind had died, but the cold had deepened. He survived, barely. In the morning he crawled back in on her word. His lips were cracked worse, but he never stole again. By the 12th day, food was low. She still had jerky barely, still had beans, but the root crevices were emptying. She began boiling pine needles into broth, stirring in fat scraped from the last piece of venison. The children didn't complain. The adults did not ask for seconds. She rotated meals, made it last. And then the cave shifted. Literally. A crack sounded in the middle of the night, a booming echo like thunder. One of the cave's upper stones, loosened by the change in temperature, split and landed inches from where Ruth had been sleeping. Dust fell. Panic rose. She calmed them fast, told them where to stand, where not to step. She pointed to the spots where the stone walls curved like a bowl, where the wind never reached. She had carved this place herself. She knew its voice. But she also knew it wouldn't hold forever. The snow might not kill them, but hunger would. On the 15th day, Ruth did something she hadn't done in years. She left. Alone, no one argued. She wrapped herself in 2 coats, pulled a scarf over her mouth, and took the staff. Down the ridge, into the valley. She knew where the cabins had been. She knew where the barns stood. She didn't make it to the first one. Halfway there she found what she was looking for: split timbers, half-rotten hay, a shattered doorframe. She dug through the rubble with numb fingers, stuffing her pack with anything that could burn. Dried corn husks, a bushel of potatoes so cold they might still be saved, an axe head. On the way back she found tracks. Not animal. Boots. Fresh. She crouched beside them, heart hammering, then followed. Half a mile up she found a man. Thin, shivering, but alive, sitting beneath a tree like he'd given up standing. When he saw her, he blinked like she was the blizzard herself. "I thought I was seeing ghosts." She knelt. "You are," she said, then reached for his hands. "But I'll take you in." When she returned to the cave, the others stared. She didn't explain. Just handed out the corn, set the kindling in a new stack, and ordered them to prepare water. The man's name was Bram. He was a preacher once. Now he was just another body saved by a cave no one had wanted. The storm didn't end that week. But something changed. The cold eased, slightly. The wind stopped clawing at the ridge. For the first time in weeks, the smoke from the vent rose clean. The children slept without shivering. And Ruth, for the first time, sat near the fire and closed her eyes. They didn't ask her to tell a story, but she spoke anyway. "My husband chose this place," she said. "Said the stone would keep us alive longer than pine. Said no one trusted rock anymore because it didn't bend. But that's the point. It doesn't bend, it holds." No one replied. They just listened. And outside, beneath 10 feet of snow, the valley held its dead in silence. By the 17th day, the cave had become something it had never been before: a settlement. Not in name, nor with any government, but in the unspoken ways that people fall into rhythm when survival becomes a shared purpose. There were 16 people now, including Ruth, and though space was tighter than ever, bodies sleeping shoulder to shoulder on stone floors, softened only by blankets and moss, there was a sense of structure, a gravity that centered around Ruth's movements. Every morning she rose before the rest, not out of discipline but necessity. The stove required maintenance, its pipe needed clearing, the fire had to be stoked before dawn if any warmth was to linger by midday. She cut fatwood down into shavings. She lit them slowly with flint when matches ran out. Her fingers ached from frostbite nips and deep cold that had settled into the joints, but she never slowed. She moved through the cave like a woman more stone than flesh. The others followed her quiet example. Even Wheeler, who had once been the type to mock any woman who dared raise a voice, had begun asking her permission before anything was taken from the food stores or kindling pile. She didn't demand it, but something in her silence commanded it. The children had changed too. Their faces, once gaunt and shocked, were fuller. Lizzie had even begun to hum, only a little, only when she thought no one was listening, but it was a sound. The kind of sound you didn't hear in a place made for dying. They were all beginning to believe they might survive. That belief nearly broke them. It started with the youngest boy, Nathan, 4 years old, the child who had arrived in his mother's arms, half frozen and mute. He'd been doing better, eating, walking on his own, whispering things to Lizzie when they played with river pebbles near the fire. But that morning he didn't wake. His breath came shallow, lips blue again. His skin burned with fever. Ruth knelt beside him, laid her palm to his forehead, and felt the kind of heat that came not from warmth but from a body breaking. The mother Sarah was beside herself, clutching him, begging Ruth for answers she didn't have. "I don't know sickness," Ruth whispered. "Only cold, only how to fight the wind." "But you've lived here years," Sarah pleaded. "You must know." "I've lived here alone." That truth fell heavy. They tried pine needle tea, snowmelt cooled and stirred with honey, cloths soaked and wrung and laid across his limbs. But Nathan only whimpered in his sleep, eyes fluttering in some nightmare place they couldn't reach. The storm didn't care. It raged again the next night, as if answering the boy's fever with its own. Snow pounded against the rock like fists. The cave groaned in places, its walls contracting with temperature shifts. A small crevice formed above the chimney slit, letting in a thin curl of wind that whistled like a ghost trying to slip inside. Ruth stayed up all night by the boy. She didn't speak, just listened to the stove's breath and the child's whimpering. By morning, Nathan was worse. Then Bram, the preacher, pulled Ruth aside. He hadn't spoken much since arriving, but there was something sharp behind his eyes now. "There's medicine," he said. "I buried some in my church cellar before the cold hit. I didn't think I'd make it back there." Ruth's eyes narrowed. "How far?" 3 miles down valley, past the split oak and the old cattle gate, south slope. She looked toward the flap of canvas, where snow had already begun crawling in at the edges like fingers. "You'll die out there," she said. "I might," he said, "but that boy will die in here." She stared at him, long and hard. Then stood. No one heard what they said, but when Ruth gathered her coat and filled her sack with fire oil, pine sap, and rope, the others knew she was leaving again. Bram tried to insist he go with her, but she shook her head. "You're better served staying alive," she said, "in case I don't make it back." She left before sunrise, alone. And this time, she didn't return by nightfall. Inside the cave, time thickened. The stove still burned, but no one sat too close. The fire felt like a guilty thing. Nathan's fever grew hotter. Sarah wept softly through the night. Bram led a prayer once, but his voice cracked halfway through and he didn't finish it. No one slept. They just watched the flap, waiting for a shape to appear in the snowlight, waiting for a sign that the storm hadn't taken her. The next day, still nothing. By evening, some began to whisper. "What if she's gone? She should have taken someone with her, Wheeler at least. She's not indestructible." Bram silenced them with one word. "Faith." But even his voice trembled. Then, on the morning of the second day, just as a wind howled loud enough to wake the children. A sound. Not a knock, but a dragging. The flap shifted, and Ruth stumbled in. She was hunched, soaked through to her bones, dragging a burlap sack clinking with glass bottles. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. A long scratch ran down her cheek. She didn't speak. Just dropped the sack and said, "It's here." Inside were 4 vials, quinine, some sulfur powder, and 2 brown bottles labeled in hand scrawl. Bram took over. He read the labels. He mixed the tonic. He fed the boy drop by drop. Nathan's breathing eased by nightfall. And Ruth didn't sit. She stood by the stove, soaked, shivering. But only after the boy's fever dropped did she finally slump down against the wall, her eyes wide open as she watched the flame. She didn't sleep, not that night, not even when they begged her. "I sleep when the fire stops," she said, "not before." The storm began to break on the 24th day. The sky lightened. The wind stopped screaming. The smoke curled true again, rising like a flag of endurance. And for the first time since the others had arrived, someone stepped outside, not Ruth but Lizzie. Just a few steps past the flap, her bare boots crunching on snow packed down from 100 exits and returns. She held her arms out like a girl meeting spring. There was no spring, only gray and white, but above her, sunlight broke. A weak shaft, but real. Behind her, others stepped out. They stared at the valley. What they saw made some fall to their knees. Every cabin was gone. Not damaged, gone. Crushed beneath collapsed drifts, roofs shattered, beams snapped. One barn had exploded outward, its walls splayed like ribs. The church Bram had once preached in was now just a blackened silhouette, chimney standing alone, a grave marker. But the cave still stood. The cave that had once been a mockery. The cave that had saved 16 lives. They didn't speak. They just turned and looked at Ruth, who stood behind them, arms crossed. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired. That night they made stew. They poured in everything: beans, jerky, dried carrots, crushed herbs from Ruth's root stash. They ate in silence, letting the warmth fill more than just their bellies. Bram raised a cup, not high, just enough. To the woman they mocked. Ruth looked down. Then said, "Don't toast me, toast the stone, it's the only one who held." The thaw took weeks. But it came. Snow receded, the creek cracked open, birds returned, not many but enough. One morning a hawk soared over the ridge and the children cheered like it was a miracle. By the time travel was safe, the survivors had to decide. Go back, try to rebuild the valley. Or stay here. Some left. Ruth let them, hugged them even. She'd earned that, but others stayed. Not because they loved the cave, but because something in them had been rewritten by it. The way they saw the world, the way they measured strength. Sarah stayed with her son, Nathan, who was now strong enough to walk again. Bram stayed, clearing the upper shelves of the cave and turning them into a tiny chapel. Wheeler stayed and started carving new shelves for wood, lining the walls with pine. And Ruth. She didn't change. Not really. She still woke first, still tended the stove, still never said more than needed. But now when she spoke they listened. Because when the snow tried to wipe them from the earth, she was the stone that held. And not one of them would forget it. Spring didn't arrive so much as creep. The snow didn't vanish in a melt but retreated in phases, first from the sunlit ridges, then off the flat stones, then finally from the path that led into what was left of the valley. Every thaw revealed something, sometimes wood, sometimes bone, occasionally a boot, and sometimes, worst of all, the hollowed-out shell of what had once been a home. From the ridge outside the cave, Ruth could see them as they emerged. Stumps of cabins split wide open, logs blackened where chimney fires had crept through the structure once heat failed and smoke no longer escaped. A lantern here, a kettle there. At first she didn't go down to investigate. But then the children started asking questions. Lizzie, who had spent most of the storm curled against her brother near the warmest part of the cave, had found a kind of boldness in survival. She was always at Ruth's side now, trailing her like a shadow, asking, watching. One afternoon she asked, "Didn't anyone else survive? Not in the valley?" Ruth had no answer, not because she didn't know, but because she feared the answer. She feared that every body the snow had buried would now be laid bare for eyes too young to understand. So one day, without announcement, Ruth took her staff, wrapped a scarf tight across her neck, and began the slow walk down to the valley ruins. Lizzie followed her. So did Wheeler. Bram watched from the ridge, hands clasped around a small wooden cross he had carved from a pine slat in a broken chair leg. They walked in silence, stepping through the softened snow, boots sinking ankle-deep in mud and water as the sun finally did its work. The scent of rot lay thick on the wind now, not the smell of death, exactly, but of earth disturbed, the kind of rawness that happens when nature is forced to bury more than it can handle. They found the rust cabin first, or what remained of it. It was split entirely down the middle as if some great hand had pressed it too hard. A pot-bellied stove lay tilted in the wreckage. A cradle sat half-buried, frozen into a slab of ice that hadn't yet melted. Nearby, the shape of a child's shoe. Wheeler stepped back and put a hand over his mouth. "They had 3 boys," he whispered. "I saw them, the day before the cold took hold." Ruth stepped forward and reached down into the ice. Her fingers chipped gently, slow, working the leather free. Not because the shoe needed saving, but because it deserved not to be forgotten. They kept walking. Cabin after cabin. Wreckage after wreckage. They found the Thompson homestead completely gone. Nothing left but a sagging trough, and a chimney pipe poking from the dirt like a finger pointing up at nothing. It was only by the time they reached the edge of the burned pine grove that they heard it, movement. A rustle, then a cough. Wheeler dropped low, his hand instinctively going to where a sidearm might have once been. But Ruth stood tall, eyes focused. "Over there," she said, "by the ash tree." They approached slow. And what they found startled all 3. A man. Thin, filthy, clothes torn to rags and clinging to him like wet paper. His beard was a snarl of ice and soot. His eyes darted from them like a wounded animal. But he was alive. And in his lap, a girl, no older than 4, wrapped in a cloak that looked like it had once belonged to her mother. Wheeler stepped forward. Are you Harlan from the logging camp?" The man nodded once violently. "Stayed in the root cellar, dug it deep. We ran out of wood by the 2nd week, but the fire kept low, ate jerky, melted snow. I didn't think anyone else." He stopped, tears welled. Ruth knelt. "You're not alone, not anymore." They brought him back up the ridge slowly. The girl didn't speak, not once, but she clung to Lizzie's hand like it was a rope back to the world. That night, as the sun faded and the shadows of spring's first stars returned to the cave's ceiling, Bram knelt near the fire and whispered, "We'll need more room." By May, they'd found 6 survivors scattered across the range. Most had stories the same as Harlan's: root cellars, storm shelters, half-collapsed barns repurposed as caves. But none had been so well-suited, so deliberate, so prepared as Ruth's stone dwelling. One man, Elias Boone, had buried his wife after the 3rd week, wrapped her in sheepskin and laid her beneath the snow with a cross made from broom handles. Another, a woman named Myra, had kept a fire burning with straw from her mattress, keeping her twins alive by sleeping directly atop the hearthstone. These were not strongholds. They were acts of desperation, and those who came to the cave did not come seeking charity. They came because they had nothing else left but breath and memory. Ruth accepted them all. Not out of softness, but necessity. Survival didn't mean hoarding. It meant planning, so she rationed. She taught them how to stack stones, how to angle vents so smoke rose without trapping heat, how to store food in carved niches where the spring melt wouldn't rot it. She was, by then, no longer just the widow Hale. She was the cave woman. A term once used to mock, now spoken with reverence. Children came to her with questions. Men came to her with axes, asking how best to fell trees near the ridge without starting a slide. Women came with roots and herbs, seeking to learn what she used to make the teas that had kept fevers at bay. Ruth never smiled. Not really. But her voice softened. And when she sat at the fire in the evenings, she no longer sat alone. Then one afternoon in June, riders came. Government men. 2 of them on clean horses, coats buttoned too tight, faces too polished. They bore the stamp of the county, frost-bitten lawmen or surveyors sent to count the living and the dead. They approached the ridge slow, hooves crunching over grass that had only just begun to rise again. Wheeler saw them first and gave a holler. Ruth stepped out. The lead man dismounted, tipped his hat. "Ma'am, name's Hargrove. County sent us to account for any survivors. Word is, most of the basin didn't make it." Ruth just nodded. "You're late." He winced at that. Roads were gone. We had to dig through 2 townships to even get here. He looked around at the cave, then at the people clustered near it. Children chasing a ball of rags, women hauling water in hollowed gourds, men splitting wood for summer stores. "You've got a whole town here," he said. Ruth shrugged. "We've got stone and heat, the rest we'll build." The second man, younger, whistled as he peered into the mouth of the cave. "You lived here all winter." "Not just me," Ruth said, "them too." Hargrove pulled a notebook from his coat. "You mind if I take down names? County'll want to record who made it." Ruth hesitated, then nodded. He began to scribble. Names, ages, where they'd come from, who they'd lost. When he got to Ruth, he looked up. "You're the widow Hale, then?" She met his gaze. "That's what they called me." He wrote, then paused. "They say everyone else laughed, before the storm, laughed at you for staying in a cave." Ruth didn't blink. "They did. And now they're gone." He closed his book. The second man asked, "Will you rebuild? A house, I mean, not just keep living in this hole." Ruth turned her eyes to the horizon, to where the cabins once stood, to where the snow had buried the pride of those who thought a roof of wood meant security. "I built a house once," she said. "It fell, he died." She looked back to the stone behind her. "This place held, I'll keep it." That summer they hollowed deeper, not to expand but to anchor. They used chisels, not hammers. They lined the back walls with moss to keep in moisture. They dug a proper vent system, using old stovepipes and strips of tin roof salvaged from the ruins. Children carved their initials into the entrance wall. Bram built a tiny altar in a side crevice, where he lit a candle each night and whispered names of the dead. Wheeler raised a totem of rocks outside the flap, one for each person the snow had taken. They called it Stonehold. A joke at first, then a name. It appeared in Hargrove's report weeks later. Stonehold Settlement, 19 survivors led by one Ruth Hale, residents, Limestone Cave. In late July, someone brought Ruth a mirror. Just a shard, found in the wreckage of what was once a kitchen. She hadn't looked in one since the day her husband died. Now she stared. Her face was harder than she remembered. Not cruel, but carved, lines at the corners of her eyes, skin weathered from wind and smoke. Her mouth held a permanent downward cast, not from sadness but decision. She set the mirror down, turned back to the fire. There were beans to stir, children to hush, wood to stack, and a world to keep alive.